Copeland, and welcome to another installment of From the Archives. As was mentioned in last week's episode, we're going to alternate between sermons by our bishop, Timothy Copeland, as well as by other ministers who have come through FPC Buford and have blessed us over the years. And so this will be the first week that we have a sermon from someone other than our bishop, and we have chosen this week to hear a message from Pastor Jesse Parker from LeGrand, Oregon. And since the time of this recording, Brother Parker has passed away and has gone on to receive his reward. But we're so thankful for the mark that he left on the apostolic movement as a whole and on our church, the number of times that he came through and ministered to us. And in this sermon, you'll hear he's essentially telling his testimony. And not only does he have an incredible testimony, he's also one of the best storytellers I ever knew. And I remember many times as a young boy sitting around the floor of a living room and hearing him tell story after story late into the night. And those of you from FPC Buford will find this interesting. It was in the early 80s, either 82 or 83, when my parents first came into contact with Brother and Sister Parker. They were preaching their first revival in Bakersfield, California, for Pastor I.H. Terry, who you'll hear Brother Parker briefly mention, and who was also an icon in Pentecost. And during that revival, it was Brother and Sister Parker who were tasked with taking care of my parents. And so they were taking them out to eat, caring for them, all that sort of thing. And it was through that process that they first became very close. And over the years, Brother Parker became one of my dad's best friends in all the world, and Sister Parker and my mom remain close to this day. And also you'll hear at the end of the sermon, Brother Parker is going to sing a song, Mercy Rewrote My Life. The song was originally written in the late 70s and then made more famous in the late 80s. But Brother Parker's mother actually originally heard it from a street preacher who was singing it. And she told Brother Parker after that she felt the song fit his life so well. And so he began to sing it very frequently. Now, if you're from FPC Buford, you know that Bishop Copeland also used to sing that song very frequently. And I spoke with Sister Parker and my mother, and it seems very likely that my dad actually learned that song from Brother Parker in the early 80s. We couldn't confirm it for sure, but it's very likely that that's where he first got it, was through his connection with Brother Parker. And it's a great song to hear Brother Parker sing at the end of the message. You can also hear a version of my dad singing it if you'd like, that's available on both Apple Music and on Spotify. If you search Timothy Copeland, Mercy Rewrote My Life, you'll find a version that he released in the mid-'80s on an album with my mother. And so we hope that you are blessed by this week's episode of From the Archives, Pastor Jesse Parker at the First Pentecostal Church of Buford on September 8th, 2013. Some say it's only thunder.
Amen. Well, I'm going to do something different tonight. I told Brother Copeland I would consider this. I've only done it probably less than a half a dozen times in over 32 or 3 years of preaching. And I want to tell you a little bit about my testimony. And when I feel like, I prayed about it and I feel like that the Lord will let me do that. Again, I mentioned this morning, I don't want to ever talk about the drug world. I can't give you my testimony without talking about the drug world. And what God brought me out of. But I don't ever want to affect young people in the wrong way. And I know I don't know if your pastors mentioned it to you, but there is a scourge in Pentecost, and it is prescription drugs. It's a devil. And they're so readily available, and I know there's no way you're going to get this many people together in a building and not have people that are addicted to prescription drugs. I know that. And so it's just that prevalent in the world today. I'm not picking on you. I'm just going to kind of tell you these are not prescription drugs I was involved in. Some of them at one time may have been, but God gave me and delivered me with a miraculous deliverance, and I would like to share some of my life with you. I've already told you little bits and pieces this morning, and then just in the testimony about my mom's song, some more. But there's so many reasons that Satan gives us to check out. We're living in a high-stress world, and there's really is a temptation just to slip it into neutral. And as I said earlier, that it's very readily available. But God, He knows all about it. He knows all about it. And they were here from the beginning of time, and the misuse of opium and all of its derivatives. But it's a poppy plant, and when you go into Mexico, there's two things that they sell down there basically, and that's black tar heroin and marijuana. There's some cocaine things smuggled through the country of Mexico, but it's not grown there and it's not manufactured there. And so the drugs that I was involved with and the people that I was involved with mainly for the first few years, I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and it's a rough world. But I do it, and I tell you and talk to you about it because of how great God is. And if you have a friend or a loved one or somebody that is entangled in any type of organized crime or anything like that, the devil tells a lie that you can't get out of that, but you can. And God can deliver you out of anything. He can break the chains of any bondage. And so I told Brother Copeland, I said, sometimes I start talking about my life in the world, and people are looking at me, and I know they're thinking he's lying. And I just told him yesterday, I said, my wife and I, when I left the church, but right about the time my dad left, we moved to town, my mom and his 5 children. Then my dad rented the place next door to a young couple, and my wife today was a cowgirl. Her dad bought a ranch from my dad when I was 9, she was 8, so just a year after the split up. And so she's been a part of my life since I was 9 years old, and went through the whole thing with me. She was either my next door neighbor, and we lived 15 miles out of town. And her dad had 200 head of horses. He was a rodeo contractor, and we knew each other. The only other kid within 5 miles was her brother. And so people say, how'd you guys get to liking each other? I said, she's the only girl within 10 miles. I had to. But we've either been next door neighbors, boyfriend and girlfriend, or married for 50 years. Well, 50 years. And that's a long time, and she, of course, went through all these times with me. She never was much of a drug user until the last few years. Of course, you just get infiltrated. But God can deliver you, and there's a beautiful testimony in it. If you've not met my wife and you were to meet her, you would never think that she was ever involved in anything illegal. And you'd just think that she was been praying all her life if you met her today. I want to direct your attention to the book of St. John chapter 12. I want to say again, thank you, Brother Copeland. And he has been a dear friend of mine. And his family, the Cardwells and McMullins, and he, through Brother Copeland and Sister Copeland, opened up a whole world of friends to the Parkers. And thank you, Brother Copeland. It really is an honor to be here. And, preachers are used to preaching. And we're all different, but when you tell a life story, it's a different thing. And I want it to be right. I want it to help you. I think sometimes it really does, even folks that are my age, good to realize that no, we have not always been protected. We have not always just walked the straight and narrow. That some of us have been exposed to the real world. And its dangers and its traps. It's maybe an unusual saying of Scripture I want to read. I think you'll understand by the time we finish tonight. But in verse number 27 of John chapter 12, it's a unique kind of setting. The Lord is talking to his disciples, and he's talking about a corn of wheat that falls in the earth and dies. And where I'm going to jump in here, it's like he just gave them a little mini sermon, and then he says this. He says, "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this cause came I unto this hour." So we know he's talking about the crucifixion. He's talking about the death. He just said, except the corn of wheat. What he's saying, except I be lifted up. It comes later. But if I don't die, nothing's going to happen, is what he's saying. I don't want to go to Calvary. And in the foreknowledge of God, he knew everything. And he did not want to go to Calvary, but he knew he must to make it all happen. That was the plan. And so in this, he said, "My soul's troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, yet this is why I'm here." Verse 28, "Father, glorify thy name." Then came there a voice from heaven saying, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." The people, therefore, that stood by, and this is where it brings us in. The people that stood by and heard it said that it thundered. Others said, an angel spake to him. So there was two groups of people in this crowd. There was a crowd, they heard the same noise. And it's clear here that it was a voice and that it said very distinct words. I have glorified it and will glorify it. I mean, that's not like saying, "Hello, John," or "Yes, Jesus, this is my son." You know, it's quite a sentence there. And so there was a group of people said, "That's thunder. That's just rumbling." And another group said, "No, an angel spake to him." And both were wrong. Well, one group was a whole lot more wrong than the other. And I know if my wife, she's an English teacher, I'd get in trouble for saying more wrong. It could be grammatically correct, but I'd still get in trouble for saying it because I don't know if it is or not. But Jesus said, "This voice came not because of me, but for your sakes." And I'm thoroughly convinced, and have been for many years, that he was not talking to the ones that said it thundered, but he was talking to the ones that were sensitive enough to say an angel spake to him. Amen. Let's. I'll just title this really. Some say it's only thunder, and let's pray and ask God to touch us tonight. Father, we love you. We thank you for the Word of God. Thank you for the touch of God. Thank you for the grace of God. Ask you to help us. Talk to us. God, give me strength. Guide me. Footsteps of a good man, a righteous man, are ordered by the Lord. Help me, Lord. Cleanse me. Forgive me if I've sinned. Lord, any imperfection or anything, guide my words tonight, I pray. In the name of the Lord. And everybody said, in Jesus' name. God bless you. You can be seated. The first time, there's a lot of people I think live a lifetime and really never hear God speak. And I'll say this to start off. I'm not a person that God, I'm not one of these people that are really spiritual. That sounds bad, doesn't it? But I was raised by a doctrinal preacher, and I believe we ought to pray all the time. I believe we ought to fast as much as our bodies can be strengthful to do it. All those things, just some spirits are not removed except by prayer and fasting. And I don't mean to say that I don't believe. I believe in that really strong. And anyway, what I meant by that is that I don't try to really operate in the supernatural in some ways. I believe a pastor needs to possess all the gifts of the Spirit. All. I really do. I don't think there's one. Your pastor may feel different. And the Bible said he gives severally as he will to everyone as they receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. But I've always felt like a pastor, preacher, we need them all. We don't need to be short any of them. That I can't tell you one that's not extremely needful and useful in the ministry. And so, yes, we want to, but a lot of times preachers, we seek to prophesy. We seek for that preaching, and it's a little different sometimes. But I know the Lord has spoke to me on several occasions. And some of them I know it was verbal, and some of those I cannot tell. Sometimes it's so direct. If you let God talk to you, it can be so direct that you know God's talking to you. It doesn't really matter if it's verbal or if it's vocal or if anyone else can hear it, which I don't think they can. And in this setting, why I use this passage of Scripture, because if God's going to deliver you, okay, you have to. There's so many things in life as you live for God in this journey I talked about this morning that you need God. You just get to places where you can't go on without Him. Remember Moses said, he said, Lord, I don't want to go up from here if your presence doesn't go with me. I was elbowing Brother Booker the other day in church just this week, and I said to him, what did Moses see from the cleft of the rock? Was it Calvary? And he looked at me, Brother Booker, what are you talking about? And I said, he saw the glory of the Lord. He knew him when he came down the Mount of Transfiguration, and he was adding that the land he would not allow Moses to visit, he visited in the land of Transfiguration. And he said, I can't go. Here's what he asked the Lord, show me your glory. That's what he was demanding. I think it's Numbers 32 or 3. And he's saying, I don't want to go any further. And you have to understand this. He'd already been through the Red Sea. He'd already been through the 10 plagues in Egypt. And when he said, show me your glory, he was not talking about, let's wipe out some more Egyptians, or let's see another miracle. When you see a sea parted and you walk across on dry land, I think you can say you've seen some glory. But he was digging deeper, and he made this statement. He said, I want to know your way. I think he was saying, I want to know your plan. This is, okay, here I said I wasn't getting spiritual, and I'm going way out on a limb here. But if you will dig, as Moses did, the Lord said, okay, you can't see my face, but this is what I said to Brother Booker. I said, I think it wasn't his backside that he showed Moses, but it was it was the time to come. He showed him into the future. I think when he put him in the cleft of the rock, he put his hand over his, and some of you probably think, if you believe all that, you are crazy. I've been told that before. You wouldn't be the first. But my point is this, he spoke to God face to face. Elijah prayed that it wouldn't rain for 3.5 years, or prayed that it wouldn't rain. I don't know that Elijah set the dates and times, but when you think that the scripture said for 3.5 years, what do you think this country looked like? 3.5 years, not one drop of rain. You think that would change things? It changed the world. And the scripture said it rained not upon the earth. It didn't just say in that country. It said it rained not upon the earth. You interpret the way you want. But if a fervent prayer from a righteous man, the Bible said, availeth much. And so whether you're a new convert or you've been living with God for a few years or 50 years, the importunity of the man knocking on the door, and when you look at that, you think, that's not even right. Or the unjust judge. He's basically saying, I'll be like the unjust judge. If you bug me enough, I'll do something that's really not fair. Because of your faith and your importunity and your desire to be spiritual. And so I'm just telling you that when I talk about God talking to me, the first time, when I was, of course, 8, my family split up, and I told you a little story when I was 9 or 10, when Brother Bean came down and prophesied over my brother and I. But when I turned 13 years old, I wanted to wrestle on the wrestling team at school, and I knew my pastor. There's no question. Don't even ask. He's not going to let you put on a singlet and get out there and wrestle. Brother Terry was a pretty conservative preacher, And so I was telling my dad they wanted me on the team. I'd been playing quarterback on the football team and involved in all the sports. And I knew there's no way. And so I went to my dad. My mother was out of town, and I called up my dad. He come pick me up. We went over to a little restaurant. I could take you to the very restaurant. And I laid my story out to him. And of course, my dad, not having all 5 of his kids gone, and the bitterness of a divorce, and 5 years down the line now, he could have seen it as retribution. He could have just hungered to have one of his children living with him. And here's what my father said to me. He said, there's only one thing for you to do, Jess, and that's go home and pack your stuff and go home with me. And that's what I wanted anyway. And I was, in the puberty and looking at girls and things like that, and I wanted the liberty that my dad's lifestyle afforded. And that very year, I started rodeoing with my wife and her brother. We did junior rodeos and things, and we were successful. The very first summer that I was back at my dad's house, won 2 or 3 bull ridings and won an all-around cowboy in the first summer. And on October the 12th, 1968, my brother Joe had come out to visit. My father and I had bought 2 little Honda 90 trail bikes, and we were riding. It was a red one and a yellow one, and we were riding them, of course, as fast as they would go. And Joe was still in town and living with my mom and my other brothers and sisters and singing with the trio. But he'd come out on the weekends. And it's about the time for him to go home. It was just dropping, the sunlight was dropping down. And somehow he got ahead of me, and I stopped to do something, and I'm going to catch him. And it's just getting, the sun is just going down where it's hard to see. And we'd been riding down these roads between the big fields. And I'd forgotten that there was this one field that we flood irrigated, and it was about 160 acres. And to drain the water from it to another field, we had just with a shovel cut it 2 shovel widths wide and across a dirt road, which uses farm road to separate plots of land. And so he's going, and he's way ahead of me. I think, I'm going to catch him. So I pin it, and those bikes would do about 60 miles an hour, wide open, if you had good traction. And I had it going as fast as it would go. And I'd forgotten about that little ditch. And I looked out about here to this brother here on the 3rd row. It seemed that close, or maybe this far away. And when I saw it in the headlight, and I only had time to just kind of freeze. And when I did, that front tire hit that ditch. It was deep. It hit it and just stopped right there. It just 60 miles an hour just slingshotted me through the air. Now, I'm just going to tell you, I think this part really was me so much more than even the Lord. But when I was flying through the air, I can still remember the position I was in. I remember going to the left. I'm turning through the air 60 miles an hour and fixed to impact the earth. And this is what came to me. This is the judgment of God. And I hit the ground. And I can't tell you the fear, because it was something I wouldn't even think of. I was a teenager. I wasn't under any conviction. I was glad to have my liberty and freedom, doing what I wanted to do, and playing ball and wrestling and doing all those things. But it just out of nowhere, this voice just spoke to me. This is the judgment of God. And when I hit the ground, I didn't know if I was going to die, end up with a broken neck or whatever. But my brother had heard or kind of saw, looked back and saw the dust flying and the big wreck. And he turns around to return. And I'm getting up off the ground. And I jumped up off the ground like that just to see if I was okay. And when I did, this leg caved in. And I sat down on the outside of that foot. And I jumped back up. I held my leg up, and it was just there was no support in it. And there wasn't a lot of pain or shock there. But there's no way you could put any pressure on it. It just wouldn't hold anything. And so Joe pulls up on the other Honda, and I said, look, man, I've dislocated my knee. And he looks at it, and he's like, wow. And right at that very minute, those seconds, my mom's pulling up in her old 880 Dodge to pick Joe up and take him back to town. And I said, go get Mom and Dad. Of course, my dad had remarried and was married to this young woman. They were all there celebrating a birthday party for the stepmother's father. And he zips up on his motorcycle, and I'm sitting, Brother Copeland, on that motorcycle kind of sideways, leaning against it. And I said, I'll just wait here till you guys come back and get me. And as soon as he pulled away, being out in the middle of that field and knowing what God just spoke to me, a fear dropped on me. It was like, you can only know if you experience it. And I could not stay out in that field by myself. I got that motorcycle up and it had to kickstart, so I leaned over on it with one foot and I started it with my hand and got on it side saddle, holding this crippled leg or this busted leg out in the air, and rode it side saddle back to the ranch house. And by the time they got my dad and another grandfather, step-grandfather out of the house to come get me, I was in the patio. But my pants, I was wearing, Levi's that were loose, maybe not this loose, but my pants were already skin tight. And the boot I had on had to be cut off with a knife. And I looked at my knee, and I was horrified when I saw my knee. It wasn't just a little swelled up ankle. This was a knee like this in a matter of about 5 minutes. Well, I ended up in the hospital. They took me to the hospital, and I laid there on the gurney at Mercy Hospital in Bakersfield, California, and I heard the doctors talking to my parents. And this is what they said. They said, well, there's a popular football player who had the same injury. His name is Gale Sayers. And he was one of the greatest running backs at that time in the world. And he had the same. I tore all 3 of my ligaments, the cruciate ligament and the interior and the exterior ligament on my knee. And they, I went through nearly 2 years of surgeries. And my doctor had hands that big. And in those days, there's no such thing as microscopic. This is 50 or 45 years ago. And they said, I remember laying there and them saying, well, if he walks, he will always walk with a limp. And he will never run again. And for a 13-year-old kid, and knowing what God had just said to me, I want to tell you something, that was thunder. It was thunder that roared in my ears. Because all the reasons I'd made up excuses about hypocrites in the church. I made up excuses about people improperly treating other young people. You can find all the excuses you need to run from God and the call of God and the touch of God. But the bottom line is always it's just rebellion. And it's covetousness. You're wanting something out there. And there's no question in my mind why that happened to me. Now, I don't normally show my legs to people, but I'm going to show you this. I want these boys to see it. You ladies, turn your head. This is nothing that's exciting. But look at that leg. That was 45 years ago. And they went through it and completely rebuilt my knee. That's the reason why the scar's that long. They had to take and pull my knee out of the skin. They cut it and remove the whole knee out and rebuild the knee, screw it together, bolt it together, attach, staple the ligaments back onto the outside of the knee and the inside of the knee. The cruciate is that that ligament you feel going down the back of your leg. It had it goes into your knee and attaches to the cruciate bone, and it had pulled so hard on that cruciate ligament that it jerked the bone, the piece of bone that it's attached to, completely out of the middle of the cruciate. And so there's a lot of rebuilding and things, and I went through 8 months of rehabilitation on crutches for 8 months, and was feeding the horses with a stiff leg. About a year later, and this leg slipped through between 2 bales of hay, and it caused my knee to be bent all the way back up. This is as far as I can bend this leg 45 years later, and so. Right back to the drawing board. I can remember going in and sitting down, and Mortimer Iger was my doctor's name. And I remember him just checking my leg out and feeling it and popping it out, and then just picks up a phone, doesn't say a word to me, just picks up a phone. Now I'm a 14-year-old young man, and he said, schedule surgery, and he never did say, you're going to have more surgery. He just did it on the phone in front of me, Brother Copeland, and I can remember my stomach just rolling, and again, God saying, we're not yet done with you yet, boy. And so another year of surgery and crutches and And I can still walk on crutches without touching either leg on the ground. I don't know if you've ever seen anybody do that, but at my age now, I was on crutches so much as a teenager that I learned to balance on them, and I can walk on them like stilts. And that's not a great thing to be bragging about. I mean, and I'll never forget a few months after the second surgery, I still have my Honda 90. It hardly hurt that thing. They're indestructible. I still see them in the same year, people riding them around LeGrand. But I was riding it, I was irrigating some land. We use siphon pipes to irrigate the property and all the hay fields and cotton fields and things. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, one morning, I was down about 3 miles from the ranch house, and I'm changing siphon pipes in the middle of the night by myself. Anybody here ever start a siphon pipe? Well, I'll tell you, there are not many farmers, but there's a trick to it, isn't there, brother? And so what you do is the pipes are set out, and you start them, you get them, you have to pump them. And there's a little rhythm to it, and then you throw them over the ditch and into the field. And you can't jerk the back end out or they'll stop, and you got to get just enough water in it. And it's kind of like siphoning with a gas hose, but only you're using a rigid pipe. And you have to carry these. It takes about 10 or 12 of these to do a quarter-mile field, quarter mile long and about 50 yards wide. And so you have to transport them. You can't do them all at once, or your ditch will break out. It's a complicated little affair when you what we call change the water. And a lot of times it happens in the middle of the night. And this was me out in the middle of the night in the summertime changing siphon pipes at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. And it takes about an hour and a half to change what we had going. We had it's 3 cubic feet of water per second flowing in the ditch. And so I get it all changed. And I looked across the ditch, and there's my motorcycle right across the ditch. And it's about a little less than here to Jordan, and maybe just 2/3 of that distance. And I'm looking at that, and you can imagine how good my right leg was. You know, it was amazingly strong. And so I'm thinking, can I jump this ditch with one leg, you know? So I got back, got my crutch. I just had one crutch because carrying siphon pipes and stuff, I got to where I just used one, and I could run with one crutch. I get a pretty good speed. And so I run up there and kind of tested just how fast I could go and get me a place on top of the border check to run. And I thought, that's not going to work. I'm going to have a wreck. And then casts were still made out of plaster of Paris. And they cost $125 or so to change if you wrecked one. And, you know, there's just all these things my dad taught me, you know, don't tear up anything that costs money. So I had a better plan. I took that crutch and I set it in the middle of that ditch. And I got my hand on it, and my arms were real strong, and for my weight and size and age, you know, but I got hold of that thing, and I said, I'm going to pole vault this ditch. And so I kind of got my leg ready to spring, and I got everything set, and I launched myself. Because it was like, it's 300, 400, 500 yards down to where the weir was, where you had to cross the ditch to get on the other side. And I'm going to do this to avoid that walk. And I got right out over the middle. And when I did, that crutch started sinking. And I'm bouncing, you know, you learn to walk on crutches after a while. You can hold yourself up for a long time without touching the ground. And I'm doing like this, and I'm getting mad. And the crutch is going deeper and deeper into the mud, and I think there's no way. And I just had to turn loose. And I fell in that ditch, and my temper went. And I'm out there by myself, so, you know, I'm not going to kick and scream and cry. But I drugged myself out of that ditch. I'll never forget this. I drugged myself out of that ditch, and I rolled over, and I looked up into heaven, and I said, why, you know, in an angry way, I looked at God, and I said, why can't I jump a ditch? And he spoke audibly to me then, and he said, you know why you can't jump a ditch. When God spoke to me, the fear that gripped my heart. I'm 14 years old now, and boy, I just whipped myself around on my face and threw my face in the dirt on that ditch bank. And I buried my face in the dirt. It held my sides. And I said this to God. I said, okay, God, okay. Just don't kill me, you know, I'm sorry. And I said, I won't say anything else ever again. I'll never say a word. I'll never complain. the fear that God put in me. I'm just telling you, if you will listen to God, God will talk to you like that. Here it is now 43 or 4 years later, and I'm telling you, I can revisit the moment like this, and I feel nearly like I felt that night. The fear of God that came over me. Now, what I want to tell you is that I never prayed again. I never talked to God. I was afraid to even open the door to any communication with God. And so, of course, the injured leg took me out of sports. And I found myself hanging around the parks after the football games, watching other guys play, and somebody hands a marijuana cigarette, and of course, you're not going to act like you're not hep, and so it started a world there in my freshman year of smoking pot and taking pills and things, and it wasn't long till I was bringing, I'd buy an ounce of marijuana and bring portions of it. I can remember the first drug dealing I did was rolling joints and taking them to school and selling joints for $1 a piece. And I mean, you could buy an ounce of good marijuana then for $10, and it was that big around, and a Ziploc baggie, and potent drugs. And it plunged me into a world of money and of power and of strength and really rule over people. And from then, for the next 10 years, I talk about teaching Bible studies to people and telling them you have to make yourself be a servant, as Paul did in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He talks about, I made myself a servant unto all. I can tell you, though, that 10 years of my life, I was making people serve me. I wasn't going to serve anybody. And my attitude was, when I met anybody, male or female, what can I get out of this person? How can I use this person to further myself? How can I use, if it's a female, I was thinking, how can I use her? If it's a male, is what can I use him as a pawn? What can I do with this guy? And it grew fast, man. By the time I graduated a year early out of high school, at 17 years old, 18 years old, I went on my first trip to Mexico. I'd gotten involved with guys and gotten in fights and things and was getting known as a guy that sold pounds and multiple pounds of marijuana in town. Just as actually before I turned 18, I had my own apartment and was dealing drugs out of my apartment and buying 10 or 15 pounds of marijuana at a time and selling it in pounds and half pounds and things like that. And I got into it with a guy that was just back from Vietnam. And cops came to my house. It was in my name, but I wasn't even old enough to have a rental agreement. There were two other men living with me that were in their middle 20s, and they weren't going to believe this kid here that doesn't hardly shave is actually the boss of this house. And those men are saying, hey, that's the guy that you need to talk to. And I just played dumb. They took me to juvenile hall. My first visit to jail was my longest visit, actually locked up at one time. It was 8 days. And I've been sentenced to years in prison, but I went to jail for 8 days because my dad had always told me, you get yourself in jail, you get yourself out. And my mother was the dean of girls at a Christian college in Gateway in St. Louis, Missouri, and she had to make a trip home and come to the juvenile hall to get me out because my dad, he'd let me stay in there till I turned 18. And probably done me some good. But I just grew fast and through those incidents and I had mentioned that I thought one guy was a snitch or some deal and it wasn't long until I was trapped at a party and some men that I'd known vaguely as these guys, smugglers and drug runners from that were all Vietnam vets at the time. This would be about 1972, 73. They cornered me. I was at a party with a bunch of people, and there's a bunch of girls and guys there, and I noticed after a little bit that all the girls were gone. And then 2/3 of the guys were gone. Now there's just like 8 guys there, and none of them were good friends of mine, and they took me in the back room, and they're going to do their Vietnam stuff on me. And I'd already at that age, my dad was an outlaw. And I think I told you this morning, anybody that'll go up to the pulpit and punch the pastor out in the pulpit, that gives you an idea of his fear level. And so I was around. My dad was around gamblers and people in high stakes and things. He just liked danger. And so what happened? I said, well, yeah, you guys can beat me up. You can. I'm sure all six of you can take care of me. And but I said, you better kill me, because if you don't kill me, I'll be back. And who I'll be back with, and I named the man. He's since passed, but he has sons that are alive today. I don't really want to tell his name, but he was a known gangster, and he lived 2 doors down. He lived on the other side of my wife's dad, and he was a modern-day gangster. And he had just shortly after that was put into prison for about 6 years for beating up an FBI agent and throwing him out the door of their car at 35 miles an hour when they found out he was a FBI agent. And so they were rough people, and I was raised around rough people, and when I mentioned that name, I don't know which of the 6 guys recognized it, but they could tell by the way I told them I wasn't kidding. And so about a month later, this Navy SEAL guy, Mike, I'll just tell you, Mike, he comes over to my house. And he says, are you interested in doing a smuggling trip? And I'd only known him, I only talked to him like 2 times. And one was at that party. He was the one shoving me in the chest and threatening me at the party. And he said, you interested in smuggling a pot out of Mexico? And I go, yeah. And he says, okay, get my car. And he drove me over and introduced me to another man that's still alive and still he's one of my Facebook friends today, so I'm not going to give you his name, but we'll just say Bill. And introduced me to him, and he said, so you want to go to Mexico? Mike says you got the goods. And I said, I want to go. And so he said, I'll call you. A couple of weeks he called me and he said, you got 1 week to be ready. Meet me, and we lived in Bakersfield, California. He said, here's a ticket to the Led Zeppelin concert in San Diego. It was 1972. I was 19 years old, or 18 years old. And he said, meet me there, and I'll tell you what we'll do from there on. So I go down to a rock and roll concert by myself in my little 4-wheel drive Scout. And he said, meet me in a certain parking lot after the concert's over. And I drove out there, and there he was. And stuff that you see in the movies, I'm a young kid. I'm looking for excitement. I'm looking for a thrill. And I went to Mexico with him, stayed 37 days, and we brought 1,400 pounds of marijuana out in the back of a camper truck. And I led him just like 5 miles ahead of him to cause interference with anybody or any roadblocks. And in those days, I see there's some Hispanic people here, and if you know where Culiacan is, that's the first place I went and spent 37 days in the state of Sinaloa. And we went into the mountains, the Black Mountains there above Culiacan, around Guasave and Sinaloa. And we put loads together and spent that time. And we actually brought it out in camper shells that were the same height as a pickup cab. And we sealed off all the windows, and there were, of course, curtained, solid duct tape windows. And we filled those full with costales, and those are like what you'd know as a gunny sack, but big, large gunny sack bags full of marijuana tops. Cola de Borrego, we call it, and it was when we first quit taking bricks and kilos out and started taking it in loose, of much higher quality. And came all the way out, and the man paid me $10,000 for a month's work. And I'm 19 years old, and you couldn't tell me anything. I turned right around, took that money and money from other people, and went back and did my own trip before I was 20 years old. I remember about the time I turned 20 years old, I walked into a bank with a backpack on, had $136,000 in cash in it, and rented a bank deposit box, a big box, and had a little homemade kind of backpack that I had it in. And I just opened the drawer and stacked it in there. After the trip that I did, you could not tell me anything. If somebody said, hey, you don't know what you're doing, or hey, you need to come over here. My dad had owned a tree service company, and he realized his influence on me caused me to get into this. It was like an adventure to me. And it was keeping my mind off of God. And I go back to Mexico, and I loaded up there around Sinaloa again, and I started out. And we get in, we pull up. I'm driving a four-wheel drive truck. I got Mike in front of me. The guy that first took me and introduced me now is working for me. And he's driving a brand new four-wheel drive Scout in front of me, and there's a roadblock. And I've got the guy that's over the state of Sinaloa. We sat and drank cognac and smoked pot with the generals of the federales, the soldiers, right in this man's house. And so he's in front of Mike, and Mike's behind him, and I'm in the back with the load. We'd been meeting an airplane all morning and loading it like 200 pounds at a time. And I told Mike on the radio, this Navy SEAL, I said, I'm not going to stop. It was roadblock, and they had barricades like that, and cops standing around with rifles and guns, and I go, I'm not stopping. And Suhike, the man that was leading and really the drug king of that southern Sinaloa, he said, no. We had little code names we used. He said, no, don't do that. He said, I just pay them a little bit of money and they'll let you buy. And I said, well, Suhike, you know the rules. And I could tell he was wanting to get away, and not face the music. And finally, I just told Mike, I just clicked the drug lord guy down there out. And I said, I said, get behind me. Pull over to the side and get right in behind me. And I said, when I get up to that roadblock, I'm going through. And I had an older Hispanic man in the truck with me, and his English was really poor. And he's like, no. He gets really nervous, And so as soon as Suhike pulled up, I had a 440 racing motor in that big old Power Wagon pickup, and I just floored that thing, and boom, right through the barricades, and cops falling off the sides, and that Navy SEAL behind me, and that Scout just flying with a big V8 and a new V8 in an International Scout. And he comes around the corner and sees me visibly. I had cut on a dirt road, and I was going 120 miles an hour on a dirt road. And there was a dust cloud going up behind it, 200, 300, 400 yards high. And he gets on, he clicks on the radio, he goes, tell me that's not you. I go, it's me. And the guy next to me, he's talking the fastest Spanish I've ever heard in my life. He grabs the radio and he starts calling for Suhike, and everybody dispersed, and they got away. And Mike, of course, he said, there's nobody going to pass me. And that was his job. And finally made it in that night, late at night. It should have been about an hour's drive. It turned into about 8 or 10 hours getting into Los Mochis. And pulled in there and got a motel room. And the way we ran, we'd wait till midnight and then take off, come up Highway 15 till we got within about 50 miles of the border, about Agua Prieta and Nogales there. And we'd cut off and go over to the Continental Divide and take those four-wheel drive pickups. We'd prop the fence. We'd find there's places where rivers would run. I hope I'm not getting guys in trouble tonight, but I'm sure it's gotten far more sophisticated. This is 35 years ago, 40. Anyway, we'd prop the fences, the border fence up sideways, and get the nose of our pickup started underneath it, in a river bottom, and we would just floor it. And we didn't care about paint getting scratched, and we'd take those four-wheel drive pickups full, clear the back of it full, right across the border, hit on some roads, and find our way out. But on the way from Los Mochis to Guaymas, Mexico, my front guy, I had one guy an hour ahead and one guy 5 minutes ahead of me. And the guy that was an hour ahead of me, I'm rolling along, and just out of the corner of my eye, hey, that's Brother Mayer. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a pickup that looks like the guy that's supposed to be an hour ahead of me, just reporting where the roadblocks are and stuff. And my radio just rattled a little bit. We had these huge Palomar amplifiers that we hooked up to CB radios and had special crystals and stuff. And so I just grabbed my mic and cued it. And I said, is that you, Brown Sugar? And it rattled again. And couldn't even hear his voice, but it just rattled. And boy, I pulled that truck over, turned around and drove back down the road and pulled up behind him. Sure enough, it was my guy. He said, man, There's a roadblock up there. It took me 45 minutes just to get. He didn't have anything in his truck. But just their suspicion, him running that time of night, they held him, and they had Mike. They would set up their roadblocks down there on Highway 15 with just smudge pots. And you'd come over Rising the road, and there'd be 20 M16s pointed at you. Right in front, right to your windshield. And so you're just try to stop without wrecking or run into people, and they're holding machine guns up at you. And so he didn't even have a chance to get to his mic. Neither one of them did before the M16s were pointing through the windows. Anybody ever been around federales? You know the story, guys. They got paid what? $5 a month to kill their brothers and their cousins? And that was the attitude down in Mexico. There wasn't a lot of respect for federales. And it was a bad deal. There was corruption everywhere. And anyway, I got stopped, and I'm like, total panic comes over me, like, what in the world am I going to do? And they had Mike, and they had this other man. Anyway, I drove back down the road, and I'm looking for a place to hide, and I see this great big brush patch with my headlights and things out in the middle of 4 or 5 miles out in the middle of the desert there. And I just ran that truck out there, and I just ran it, just drove over cactus and everything, ran it out in the middle of that brush patch and shut it down, turned it off, and I was hidden from all around me. And I sat there, and I told Richard, I said, do what you can, wait here to get Mike out, and then, come and find me. Just told him on the radio, he didn't know where I was. And I thought, it's time to pray again. I told you that old story to tell you, it'd been like 5 or 6 or 7 years I hadn't said a word to God. And I thought, God, I'm in a bind here. And it was almost like, let's make a deal. I know a lot of people don't believe this, but God will bargain with you when you're in a strait. And I said, God, if I hardly ever ask you for anything. I hadn't spoke to God or God spoke to me since that ditch bank affair. But I said, God, if you'll get me out of here, I'll never come back. That's the deal I offered. And I had about that much water in a small igloo ice chest. And after running through the desert to get away and get out in that brush patch, my four-wheel drive truck was covered with mud. And I got out there and I took my T-shirt off, took my T-shirt off, and I dipped my T-shirt. It was a brand new four-wheel drive truck, root beer brown, power wagon, and I washed that entire truck with that much water in a nice chest that big. So I basically scratched the mud off of that truck. And when I finished, I kept my radio on for Richard, and I finished washing that truck. I was, not exhausted, but you wouldn't think it would be time to take a nap. But I prayed that prayer, and I went and laid down in the seat of my truck, and I just went fast asleep. And there are federales everywhere. That's what Richard told me. They're looking for you. They're going to find you. They know there's a load out here. And usually in the morning, they put up a plane and find you. And so I hadn't seen Richard for about 5 or 6 hours, and I'm laying there in that pickup, Billy Copeland, and the door was open, and we had our lights fixed. There weren't dome lights and things, but I'm laying there in that pickup, and somebody starts pulling on my, and I'm not pulling your leg, pulling my leg, grabbed my leg and shaking it, and I woke up and I looked, I was expecting to look into the gun barrel, and it was Richard. He said, "How did you get here?" And I looked at him and I said, "How did you find me?" He said, "I would drive around the hills up here, and I would cue my mic, and I could hear it pop down there in the brush. I hear it, electronic pop when I would cue the mic." And he said, "I just bird dogged you out." And I said, "Where's Mike?" He said, "Federales still have him." I woke up, I looked around, and I said, "No, they're gone now. The checkpoint's gone." It was an assurance. It was almost like I was fearless. Like, I'm not going to get caught. And Richard says, "No way I'm going." I said, "No, you work for me. Go up the road, and you call me back as soon as you see that the checkpoint's gone." He goes, I just saw it from a distance an hour ago." I said, "Go." Oh, Richard, he's big as Brother Booker. He's 6'8". Big old, he looked like one of these Vikings that you read about. in history that found America, and huge, blonde-headed guy, 6'8" and 300 pounds, and okay. And about 3 minutes later, he goes, "They're gone." And I just got in my rig, and he said, "Mike's here." They let him go. We drove the next 350, 400 miles. We got to the Mexican border. Neither one of those guys would cross with me. My lead wouldn't go. These are Navy SEALs, and they said, "You're crazy. We're not going." And I said, "Well, prop the fence up for me. I'll go by myself." And took my wallet out and handed the roll of cash I had to Mike so he could get out, and said goodbye. And that next night, I was pulling up to my sister-in-law's house where my wife had stayed the whole time I was gone. Hadn't heard one word from me, a truckload of pot, and this promise to God that I wouldn't go back. Now, time's not going to prevent me tonight to tell you, but I'll briefly tell you this. I had a doctor's son that had taught the guy who taught me how to do these trips, talked me into sponsoring him, and he took my truck, one of my trucks, and I went all the way to the border, and they couldn't figure out why I wouldn't drive it across. I would not cross the Mexican border, and while I'm showing him the route and the places you have to take to get across the line, and where to go after that into Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, I was showing him the route. Now it had changed from when he had done it, and he's fooling around with some cocaine and his girlfriend. This guy was 3/4 of the way through being a biochemist at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. He's supposed to be a smart man. And he rolls a brand new truck of mine right in front of me and my wife. We're following him right a mile from the border. And I about lost it. And so we needed to get another truck quickly to keep this trip all together. And so I go, okay. I break the rule, and I smuggle this pickup. I didn't smuggle it. I took it through and got papers on it. But I came out. I walked out of Mexico that time without no bike, no horse, no mule. And I'll never forget that day. I got out. The whole time, I'm remembering the promise I made God. I never told a human. I never told my wife. I never told her about the ditch bank experience. I never told anybody, not one soul. But of course, my wife had a baby then, Megan, and her dad, Doug's dad, was our pediatrician, Dr. Forney, there in Bakersfield, and Doug got caught with in my truck 1,800 pounds of pot, and put, long story short, in prison. But in those days, he did on 1,800 pounds of pot with a lawyer. And our friends, those gangsters, he did 6 months with Ulrich Menn and the guys from Watergate. It was a joke. But I knew the whole time. It broke me. By the time we got through it, and the costs and the expenses and everything I lost and the load and everything, nearly all the money I had saved up or had saved was gone. And I remember going to a place where I had money stashed, and I had 10s and 5s. You know, you take in lots of money, and you spend the big bills first, and then you get down, it's like your piggy bank. And the Lord's talking to me the whole time saying, when are you going to give up, son? When are you going to cash in? When are you going to do what you said you were going to do? And my house got raided. It was really a freak deal. Nobody around me knew that I did drugs or anything like that. I was clean cut. And anyway, it was a weird situation. Alarm system went off. Police came to check my house for burglars, and there's 420 pounds of pot in one of the back rooms being misted and out, getting ready to put in packages and sale. And so my wife and I, we had to run. There were people saw policemen, plainclothesmen going in my house and got a hold of us. And this is, of course, pre-cell phone days. And they found us. My wife was a dental tech, worked at a dentist's office in town. And we went to Oregon for 2 years. And we went right where, really close to the place I pastor today. And it took the federals 2 years to find me, the United States government. And we were just out bowling one night. And when we left the bowling alley, it only had 4 lanes in this little mountain town. And we walked out, and these men set up an arrest situation for me. And of course, I went back and faced my judgment on the 420 pounds. You may have heard me tell about, I know Brother Copeland recorded the song, Mercy Rewrote My Life. And my mother had gotten that song off the streets in Dallas, Texas. We don't know the author. The author's still unknown. And I think Brother Copeland thought I had or knew the author of the song when he recorded it. But I sang it when I first got in church because in this court, sentencing day, I was to be sentenced to 3 years in prison for the pot charge, and we'd stretched it out like 3 years now. And my mother told me that she got a hold of my hand. She fasted and prayed and came to my court date, and she's the only one of my family that ever attended any court dates. And she said, Jesse, I want to tell you something. She said, the Bible said in James that mercy rejoiceth against judgment. And she says, I want you to pray with me. She got a hold of Robin's hand, my wife, said, I want us all three to pray before you're sentenced here and ask God for mercy. And what it means, you know, I was 12 years old when I left church, or just turned 13. I didn't really have a grasp of the scriptures. But she says, what it means is when you're guilty and you know you're guilty, she says the judge knows you're guilty, your probation, parole, pre-parole guy knows you're guilty. Everybody in this courtroom knows you're guilty. But I never would confess. I never, even in pre-sentencing, said, you're fixing to get sentenced. You're sentenced to go lighter if you'll just admit. And I just told them no, it was somebody else's. You know, I knew it was there, but it was someone else's. And so the judge gets up and sentenced me to 3 years. And he said, I'm going to, we'll suspend, not take it out, but I'll suspend 2 years and you do 100 or 365 days flat in the county jail. In those days, it was like 1976. That's what we call a bullet. And it's like getting shot because there's no daylight. You go down 3 stories underground and you don't see the sun for 365 days. You don't get any good time. You go in on November 12th, you get out on November 11th. And so I took my sentence and I went to jail. And 4 days later, I was out trimming trees I talked my way out of that jail in 4 days onto a farm. And I just went in there and lied to him, told him, I said, the judge told me I was supposed to be at the county farm. And they sent me to the county farm. And so the judge tells the bailiff, says, go down and get Jess Parker. He's down in the county jail. And the bailiff comes back and says, he's not here. He's at road camp. And the judge's like, go get him. And it's 30 miles out of town up in North Kern, in Kern County. And I'm out trimming trees. The men that ran the whole camp, there's about 500 men in about 10 dormitories out there. And he looks at me and he looks at my paper, and he had run the county fair for years. And he looked at me, he looked at the paper, he said, are you Brownie's son? Which is my dad. And I said, yes, sir. And he just shook his head at me. And he said, you're in here for a year. I said, yeah. He said, do you trim trees? I said, yes, sir. And he said, okay, you see me in a little bit. He gave me a truck and a couple guys to work for me, and I'm trimming trees for the county. So when the bailiff comes to the road camp and I'm not there, they say he's trimming trees down there, certain, and they pull right up there, and the guy looks up at me and he said, are you Jess Parker? And I said, yes. He said, come down out of that tree right now. You judge, I don't know what to say, but the judge wants to talk to you. And I thought, whoa. This is getting serious. And I walked in that courtroom, and the judge looked at me and he said, when I sentenced you the other day, he said, I did not want to send you to jail. I had letters from my pastor. I had letters from businessmen. I had letters from people in church, and he got a history of the apostolic church and me being a prodigal stray. And he said, I'm going to turn you loose today, 4 days after I've been put in on a 3-year sentence. I remember I got up and I had jail clothes on. I just started to walk out the door. I said, I'm out of here. And he said, no, Miss Parker, you got to check out. You got to get some different clothes on. And I wish I could tell you right now that my mom telling me that story and God having mercy on me, But I went 4 more years into hard drugs. I'm not going to get into tonight. Let's stand. I don't want to take the time really, or I think it's time to close the service. But of course, I was out of Mexico. I couldn't go back in the country of Mexico because of the problems I'd had and vehicles and things that were in trouble down there. And all it did really to me, I kept fighting God. And I got into hard drugs, got into the use of cocaine and the sales of cocaine. And about 4 years later, I was arrested in the Holiday Inn on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, California, the 27th floor, with a pound of cocaine. And my wife and I were selling about 3 to 4 pounds a week. And I was just doing a pickup thing and got into a scuffle with a couple of guys. And anyway, the cops came in. And after about 6 hours of interrogation, I just finally bowed my head there in that room. And I said, I'm gonna do 10 years this time. I for this amount. Drug people know pretty much what you get caught with, you're gonna get prosecuted. We know better than the lawyers do practically how much time it's going, because we know what everybody else had to do. And I thought, here's 10 years of my life. I was 25 years old. And I said, here goes 10 years of my life. And I remember God speaking to me there and saying, you were raised better than this. I looked at those policemen and I looked at the people that I were with, and God just spoke to my heart and told me, you're raised better than this, Jesse. And but I made up my mind. I'll do my time. And it's another story for another night. But 6 months later, I've never ratted. I've never been a snitch. I wouldn't be here preaching. I wouldn't be telling you. I think most of you know that the marijuana business in America today is run by the Mexican cartel, and the cocaine business is run by the Italians. And there are guys that actually trafficked in between and back and forth between the two. And when I came to church, I told my pastor, told Brother Terry, my uncle, the trouble I'd been in, and just skimmed over the top. And he said, well, are you going to be in trouble? I said, I don't know. But there's still rumblings. I mean, it's been, I've had the Holy Ghost. Well, it was just this past week, September the 4th, 1980, is the day God refilled me with the baptism of the Holy Ghost. So I've had the Holy Ghost 34 years. I've never seen one speck of cocaine. I hadn't seen any marijuana until a young man left some in just a pipe in one of my work trucks that I was cleaning out a couple years ago. And I had not seen any marijuana that I could identify at all, not even a leaf of it, for 32 years. And to go from a place where you transport and traffic tons and tons of the stuff, of the marijuana a year, and 20, 25 pounds of cocaine a month, I've never seen cocaine since. I haven't even seen one little bit in one little baggie. And if somebody opened a bag of either one, I could identify it if you were on the back row, the smell. And I've been, of course, in dreams and things, tempted and tortured. But I can tell you to this day, I've never touched a drug for 34 years like that. Never touched it. Never touched my hand. I'd like to tell you about how the first drug God delivered me from was nicotine. And I had more trouble getting delivered from it bothered me more than any drug, cigarette smoking. And I'll tell you this, it's been 34 years. I've not even touched a butt. People have put them out in the parking lot of my church, Brother Copeland, and I go get somebody else and say, move that, because I won't touch it. that God delivered me. I never went to rehab. I've never had detox. I've never had to be detoxed. I can't tell you how many people I've helped detox. Most of them are from prescription medicine. But I'm working with somebody right now, detoxed them, a relative. But I never had one, what is it called? Not a relapse, but where you withdraw. Thank you. I've never had one withdrawal. And it's amazing. Because God, I'll tell you what, when you turn it over to God, and God, you make a deal with God, and you say, God, I will follow you. But the point I'm telling you, I want to tell you this, is a month after that my wife was ready to leave me, and we had two little babies. Candace was a baby, and Megan was 2.5 years old. And her parents from Wyoming convinced her to take a plane. They bought her a ticket. And they told my wife, they said, come stay with us for at least a month. And I knew when I drove her down to the airport, Brother Copeland, I thought, I may never see my kids again. And I may never see my wife again. And I don't think we're not going to be married after this. But I took her and I put them both, all three of them, on the plane. And I looked at Robbie and I told her, I said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, you go have your visit with your dad, but you come back in a month. And I said, things will be different at our house. I had 2 other homes in that town that I stayed at partially. I had 3 houses then. And my wife just stayed home like a faithful wife the whole time. And so she left. And she came back a month later. And I went to Santa Cruz and found Bino, my old buddy. And he was living in a nudist colony. And I had made him and his wife both get clothes on and get in my car. And this is 300 miles from Bakersfield to Santa Cruz. And I brought him back to Bakersfield. I said, we're going back in the tree business because I don't have a job anymore. And when a drug dealer quits his job, if you're going to live for God or you're going to go in search of God, you can't be selling drugs. And that's the first step that I made. My wife was gone 1 month, and when she got back, Bino and Debbie were living in the house with me, and it was only a week or so after she got back that I did the story I told you about when I just got up on Sunday morning and said, we're all going to church. A month later, I got my hands in the air praising God and tears streaming down my face. And I was taking a couple times. I had people pull in my driveway, and I had this big, huge black man, Richard Griffith. He played for the Phillies and played for the Dodgers. And he was one of my dearest friends. We called him Bear. He grew a full beard, and he's about 6'6", and he was just my buddy and took care of me all the time. Anyway, he came, when my wife would have a mouse in the house that got caught in a trap, she called Richard. When I wasn't there, we were close. And Richard would pull up in my driveway, and I'd walk out on the front steps. He was the guy that had women that he sold on the street. We passed him every time we went to church. And Richard would pull up we called him Bear would pull up in my driveway, and he'd roll the window down, the window down in his car, and I'm standing on the front porch, my hair's all cut and no whiskers and things, and Richard's got this big old grin. He goes, Parker, you still going to church, man? I'd say, sure am. You want to go? Maybe later. The window go back up. I had another guy we called the Pig. This guy's busted in South America, went to prison twice in South America for cocaine smuggling. He'd come over, knock on the door, 3 o'clock in the morning. I'd get up, go to the door, hear the Pig. Hey, I don't mind telling you, his name is Bill Steinmetz. And Bill would be at the door. I go, what do you want? He said, do you have any liquor in the house? I've been in church a couple of months. I go, yeah. We never hauled out a bottle of liquor. We had a liquor cabinet full of it. I go, come on in. Come in the house. I walked him over to the liquor cabinet, opened the door of the liquor cabinet. I said, help yourself, because I hadn't touched it. I didn't want to pour it down the drain. I can tell you right now, I'm not touched a bottle of liquor that I know in 34 years. And we had a liquor cabinet full of it. I wouldn't even pour it down the drain, Brother Coben. And so for the next couple of months, whenever he was out after hours, they shut down buying liquor at 2 a.m. in California. I'd get a knock in the middle of the night. It would be Bill coming to empty out my cabinet. Pretty soon, the last bottle was gone. He never came back again. I'd pull over on Union Avenue. You know the street, Brother Copeland, on the way to church. I still lived about 12, 14 miles from the church. It's on the north end of town, and I lived on the south end of town. And Union Avenue, old 99, goes up through California. That's where all the prostitutes and everybody were out on the road. They'd just stand right out on the road nearly and block your car. And I'd see Richard or Butch or one of the guys that worked for me for years, and I'd pull that little station wagon over. I'd get out of the car, and those prostitutes, hey, you know, I have my wife and my girls, my little babies with me. And I'd get out of there, I'd be in a suit and tie, and I'd walk over to Richard and say, come on, you promised me you'd go to church with me. And he'd stop and say, I'm going to one of these days. Yes, I'm going to go. But several times I stopped in the midst of that prostitution and tried to get those guys in the car. Now, I know God talked to him. Well, I told you about us winning friends and drug people. That's the only people I knew. The first 20 people we won to God in Bakersfield, me and my wife, were all ex-drug friends. And God saw the deliverance, is what I'm trying to tell you. If you will give it to God, you'll get delivered. And the message you will send to everybody that knows you, don't run off somewhere. Stay right there. Stay right here where you live and live the life right in front of people. God, I think it made me stronger driving up Union Avenue for 3.5 years on the way to church. And all those people knew me. But God kept me every time. Amen. Let's love the Lord tonight and thank him. I love you, Lord. I appreciate you. I had to ask Brother Copeland words of this song. I know you know it. But mercy rewrote my life. Oh, God's mercy rewrote my life. You see that I could have fallen and my soul cast way down, but his mercy, it rewrote my life. For years I had traveled a road all alone. My life had lost all its joy and its song. Oh, the grace, it placed me right where I belong. When his mercy rewrote my life. Can you raise your hands